Welcome back. This is part 2 in an ongoing series of videos sharing practical tips, tools, and tactics for aspiring spoken word artists. And in this video, I wanted to address what is maybe the most common question I get from people, which is, where do you get your ideas? And I think there are two ways to interpret that question. One is about topic itself, and one is about how we approach those topics. So very briefly, in terms of topic, like what made you want to write about the stuff that you write about? Masculinity, working class identity, political stuff, whatever. This really gets to one of my personal foundational philosophies about art, which is that good writing doesn't necessarily come from good writers. I want to be a good writer, and it's very important to have discipline and to write a lot and to challenge ourselves as artists to become better. But I don't think that means that what we should do is lock ourselves up in a cabin somewhere and just sit down and write for a whole year and let the genius spill out of our heads. I don't think it works that way. For me, the best writing, more often than not, just comes from people who live their lives and experience the world and engage in a meaningful way with their communities, and then happen to write about it too. So if you don't know what to write about, read the newspaper, follow interesting people on Twitter, read books, physically take yourself and go to lectures and art shows and rallies and city council meetings and rap shows and plays and barbecues and just take in the world around you. There is always something to write about, and you always have something to say. And that mindset by itself is a really important thing to just be intentional about. But the second way of interpreting that question, where do you get your ideas, has to do with the approach. So when you have something that you want to write about, an issue or a topic or an idea, how do you start? And I think that's a great question, and that's what this video is really going to be about. So for me, the answer to that question is almost always about converting an abstract idea to a concrete thing. Basically, I think things are easier to write about than ideas, and that poems about things are usually more powerful than poems about ideas. This is about showing versus telling, about concrete versus abstract language. So for example, love is an abstract word because you know what that word means, but when I say the word love, a million different people are going to think of a million different things in their head. It's not something that we can hold in our hands or take a bite out of or smash on the ground to see what kind of sound it makes. It's just an idea. Whereas an elderly couple sitting on a park bench holding hands as the sun sets, that's concrete. Because it's still about the idea of love, but you can visualize it and you can fill in the other details, which is almost always more powerful than just talking about love. You can tell us that Johnny was sad, or you can show us, Johnny was crying, or Johnny wept, or you can go even further and say thunder bellowed in the distance as a single tear rolled down Johnny's face. I think a big part of what we do as poets, especially spoken word poets, is taking abstract ideas like love and sadness, but also family, freedom, anger, racism, depression, friendship, religion, politics, all these things that we want to write about, and zooming in on them, converting these big topics into something manageable and something that comes to life in the audience's head. Here's a visual way to think about this. I'm gonna break out the whiteboard. I learned this diagram from a poet named Eric Mata. I don't know where he got it, but it's been really helpful to me. If you've ever seen a workshop from me, you've probably seen this before. But it's just one way to think about this whole idea. So that's the earth, right? And the sun's out. This is the story of two people. One of the people, every day his hobby is to walk along the beach with a metal detector. And a metal detector can, reach down a few feet down into the ground, and he'll walk from point A to point B every day and find, some scrap metal and some bottle caps and maybe some quarters or nickels or whatever. And that's what he does. This other person is an archaeologist. And they do the same thing in that they're digging into the ground, but they take a very small piece of land, 2 feet by 2 feet, and dig down. Because down here is where you'll find, dinosaurs and treasure chests and the really valuable stuff. And I think as artists, and especially as poets, the lesson here is that the more ground you try to cover, the less deep you can get with it. One strategy that I have whenever I have an issue or topic that I want to talk about, rather than just trying to talk about that really big thing, I try to think of something small that encapsulates that big idea. So like it could be a moment, a scene, an object, a face, something small, right? And then when you focus on that small thing, it allows you to add a lot of detail and a lot of depth to your thought. So it's not the most beautiful picture, but I think you get what I'm saying, right? I may have said this in the other video, but it's the difference between writing a poem about war and writing a poem about what it's like to stand in your brother's empty bedroom. You know, writing a poem about family versus writing a poem about a specific moment in your life that encapsulates the idea of family for you, or that made you think about the idea of family in an interesting way. As poets, we want to be archaeologists. We want to dig deep. And that doesn't mean that, like, if you want to write about bullying in school, that your entire poem has to only focus on one tiny little image. Like that moment when you notice someone's name carved into your desk and you wonder who they were. Like, that can, however, be the starting point. That can be a central image for the rest of your poem, to bring all of your thoughts into a cohesive, a narrative or a cohesive whole. So all of that is like the theory, right? Showing versus telling, concrete versus abstract language, focus and specificity. But I also want to share a few like really concrete strategies for the writers out there. One strategy is just a word cloud, free write. So like when you have a topic, you sit down and you say that word in your head or say it out loud and just write down everything you see or hear or taste or whatever when you think of that topic. So for example, if you want to write about environmental justice, like you could just get up on stage and be like, hey everyone, environmental justice is a thing that we should think about because it's important. But again, it's often more powerful to make it concrete. So when you hear the words environmental justice, what images pop into your head? Might be rivers, trees, smokestacks, lake, fish, dead fish, brown cloud, factory, cough, hack, phlegm, doctor's office, the magazines at the doctor's office. You let your mind wander down all these different paths. And you try to fill up an entire page or 2 pages or 3 pages with just images and people and objects and moments. These then can be the building blocks. So rather than starting a poem from scratch, from a place of here's what I think, you use some of these concrete images to paint a picture and really draw the reader or the audience in. 2, another strategy is the framing device. So sometimes we sit down to write and it is, a here's what I think kind of poem. And that's okay. Sometimes that's what you need to do to express yourself. But one just simple strategy here is to take this kind of rant that you wrote and add a narrative element to the beginning and maybe again at the end. So it's like, you may write, to use this example again, I think it's messed up that we don't take better care of the environment. But ask yourself, what happened that made you have that thought? What experience can you describe in detail that would have made you or the character in your poem write that? So it may be like, as I sit in class and watch this documentary about a polar bear starving to death, I noticed the other students goofing off or sleeping or even laughing. And then you could go into your rants about how it's messed up that we don't pay more attention to the environment or whatever. And then maybe at the end of the poem you bring it back. And you end the poem in that same concrete reality, like, and then the bell rings and I'm off to my next class, promising myself that I will never forget or whatever. It's just that when a poem begins and ends in a specific moment or situation or scene, I find, for me, that it's generally more powerful, more attention-getting, and more memorable. And the framing device is just, one strategy. It's one way for us to still write those rant and rave poems that so many of us like to write, but just adding a little extra weight to them, making them more real in the audience's head. I think a poem or songs, I think songwriters that I know and MCs do this a lot. When the poem or song takes place entirely in your head, it's just generally, it's not as interesting for me as a poem that maybe takes place in your head but also exists in a real situation, a real scene. So I'm going to wrap this up. One last strategy for doing everything we're talking about here, making things concrete, is to focus on yourself. They say write what you know. And I don't think that's an absolute. It's not a rule that you have to follow all the time, but it is a very valid approach or strategy. How do you fit into this big abstract topic that you're writing about. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do as a spoken word artist is just tell your story, you know? And you can get creative with it too. Like, if you've experienced poverty, you can write about your experience with poverty. If you haven't experienced poverty, but you still want to write about it, you can still explore your own relationship to poverty. You know, you don't speak for someone else or try to tell someone else's story, but you can still interrogate your own experiences. So, like, rather than writing a persona poem about what it's like to be a homeless person, if you've never experienced homelessness, you write a poem about yourself and what it feels like to walk by a person experiencing homelessness on the street. You know, what do you see? What's the situation? What goes through your head, etc. Rather than telling the story of like a moment of violence that happened to somebody else, you can tell the story of when you first heard about that moment of violence, or do a persona poem from the perspective of someone else at the scene who witnessed this moment of violence. You know, describe your surroundings, your feelings, take it from there. And that's a deeper point about perspective and about telling our own stories that we may come back to in a different video. But it's important to think about. You know, I hope all of these thoughts and strategies make sense. Before we wrap up, I want to share 5 examples of poems that I think do everything we're talking about here really well. I'll mention them here, but I'll also link to them in the About section but below this video. One of them is Ed Bockley's If in America. One of them is Lauren Zuniga's World's Tallest Hill. Homeless Ryan Kay's For Joseph. Andrea Gibson's Letter to a Playground Bully, and just, you know, as a multidisciplinary example, Lupe Fiasco's Kick Push. These are all pieces of art that I think do a great job harnessing the power of concrete language and specificity. So yeah, a bunch more videos coming soon. Again, if you like it, feel free to ask any questions or share it with people you know who are writers. I hope this can be useful to you.